Business leaders know the future is already here. The economy is shifting. Non-humans are entering the workforce. Nothing feels certain. SHRM understands those evolving challenges, both in the workplace and the wider world. In this podcast, we'll bring together authors, researchers, executives, and non-traditional experts to help you take on the challenges others haven't yet considered. Because you don't need to be a futurist, you need actionable insights now. You need to be a Tomorrowist. I'm Jerry Wan, and welcome to this week's episode of Tomorrowist, where we explore the trends shaping the future of work and how business leaders can stay ahead. We talk a lot about the operational risks of climate change, hurricanes, wildfires, heat waves. These events can disrupt supply chains, halt production, and even shut down offices. But what we talk about less is the emotional and psychological toll they take on employees. This week, we're asking a question more business leaders should be considering. Why is climate change a mental health issue? Joining us to explore this is Marjorie Morrison, SHRM's mental health executive in residence. Marjorie has spent her career at the intersection of mental health and workforce well-being. She's the founder of PsychHub, a trained therapist, and a leading voice on how workplaces can better support employee mental health, especially in times of crisis. Marjorie, welcome to Tomorrowist.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Let's start with the big picture. Why is climate change a mental health issue?
I think we've never really talked about this in a big enough landscape between what happens with climate change and really we're talking about like extreme weather events and the mental health of individuals and employers that get impacted. And then how does that affect the workplace, right? So it's not something that's intuitive that everybody's thinking about, but yet they're really connected in a lot of different ways. There's like a few different ways that we could look at it. One of them is when you've had direct exposure to an extreme weather event. So when I'm like referring to extreme weather, I'm thinking about things like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, wildfires, earthquakes. It could be extreme heat. It could be extreme, cold, snow, ice, things like that. And when you've been exposed to these kind of extreme things, it can lead to a lot of different psychological effects, things like stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD. And it also can have socioeconomic disruptions, right? If you think about it, now all of a sudden you're evacuated. Maybe your job is you can't physically go there because there are some issues. There might be issues with food insecurity. Maybe you can't get food, things like that. That can always like exacerbate mental health things. And I mean, there's a whole new, Jerry, a whole new kind of theme going on right now called eco anxiety. And it's really about that fear of what's going to happen as the climate continues to change over the years. And what is the grief around it? What is the helplessness around it? And just kind of that fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I think we've started to see people change even just the way that we talk about climate change and its effects from a if to a when, right? And I think we've seen across the country, whether it be North Carolina or Katrina in the South, Hawaii, the wildfires, and even where I live in Los Angeles, we had the fires at the beginning of 2025. And we start to see both the direct impact, as you mentioned, the immediate, how do we help people, and then the lingering economic effects, the lingering social effects of I have personal friends who've lost homes and who've had to, figure life out. And like you said, it does carry an extreme emotional and mental toll that we don't quite talk about. And so let's connect this back to business, right? And how do you see these issues impacting the bottom line or how work for or companies, talk about climate change, how employees are impacted by all of these things?
I think, like, first, your lead up to that question is exactly right. I mean, one of the reasons and ways I became passionate about this was during the LA fires. And I grew up in Los Angeles and just seeing so much of the city disrupted. At the same time, it was on the heels of what was going on in North Carolina. And so and there was that kind of uncertainty as far as like, okay, there was a pop up fire here. Was it going to get contained? And so, like, when I think about an individual, right? All of that impacts businesses. When you think about these extreme weathers, what happens to things like infrastructure, right? All of a sudden now there's power cables are down and maybe you don't have electricity or you don't have the internet. Or what if it like disrupts supply chain? It halts your operations. All of that can lead to financial stress. And then there's these increased costs that maybe we didn't plan on, right? When maybe there's damage to the infrastructure that has to be, replaced. Now insurance costs could go up. I mean, that's kind of one of these issues now. We had insurance. Did you have enough insurance? And then what is it going to cost to continue to insure? And then there's compliance, right? What needs to happen when things go wrong? And all of that can disrupt the everyday operations of a company. And then there's like also, I think like more of the reputational risk, right? Like what happens to companies that, are involved in something, you hear in all of these things, was it someone's fault? Was there a
Mm.
company? You want to make sure that as a workplace that you're on the right side of history, if you will, when these types of events happen. So all of those things I think really impact the companies. Then there's the mental health piece, right? Do we have productivity loss? Like if people are stressed and they're going through all of this anxiety about living and all of the things that those pressures that affects productivity, that can affect turnover, right? If people are not able to sort of perform at work, maybe they're changing. There's healthcare expenses with so many companies being self-insured. We're all workplaces are incurring a lot of healthcare costs. So the more kind of issues that we have going on that are unaddressed, that can escalate workplaces. So I think there's a lot here to discuss.
Well, there certainly is a lot, and one thing that I experienced, and just through the lives of my friends and even myself, is we talk about the direct business impacts, right? Offices, factories. But as we have, lived now in a remote first workplace or work from home environment, the ability for people to have shown up to work the following day, right? And so there were people directly in the path of fires and hurricanes who are immediately displaced. But then the secondary or the tertiary impact of this is that people don't have the capacity to show up to work, even in a virtual setting, right? And so
Right.
if you are packing up your car to evacuate, you're physically able to log into a Zoom call, but are you going to? And will you
Right.
be in a state of mind to function and to be productive? And what is, and the evolving question is then, how does the responsibility or the impact of that play in an employee-employer relationship? And particularly, and not just in Los Angeles, but across the board, we have a lot of entrepreneurs and solopreneurs whose businesses were impacted, but that's not a big business question, but it does impact it. And so, we saw in Los Angeles, particularly events being canceled, productions being halted, restrictions on outside activities, entire school districts and their employers, right? Districts are employers with teachers and staff, everything being impacted. And so we see the direct impacts of it, but I'm really glad that we're getting a chance to talk about the emotional toll and the mental toll of some of these things. And from your professional lens, how does the mental toll of extreme weather events differ from other kinds of stressors when we talk about the mental health impact of workplace situations?
That's a great question. In a lot of ways it's the same, and then in some ways it's different. And I think it's so important. This is such an important conversation to have, Jerry, because I think you had said earlier, it's really not a matter of if, it's when. Because even if it isn't a tornado or a hurricane or a flash flood or a fire or an earthquake, extreme heat, extreme cold, we're seeing those trends happening, right? So this is really something that impacts every workplace. So I think some of the ways that, you're going to see it differ, and that's why we really have to pay attention, is that it's so sudden, right? They tend to be very severe and very sudden. And oftentimes we don't have any warning. Right? Now, in some cases, we might know when it's like a hurricane, but in a lot of these instances, we don't. Sometimes fires, earthquakes, we don't have any. So there's that kind of level of severity that comes with it. That can be very, very stressful. That can lead to things like PTSD, anxiety, depression, things like that. The other problem is that, and you experience this firsthand in LA, is the repeated exposure. So, oftentimes what happens is, right, there was a fire and then another fire spurts out and then another one. And so you keep getting re-traumatized to something. common in earthquakes where we have these aftershocks. So, we have some of these things that keep going. You get a real disruption in basic services. Like you kind of mentioned that where all of a sudden things are canceled. But when we're dealing with these extreme weathers, it affects everyone. So different than something that might affect you or someone dies or you're exposed to your own sort of micro traumatic event. These are kind of macro traumatic events. And so you think about you may not have electricity, you may not have food, you may not be able to go to the grocery store, you can't do your delivery, right? And so all of those things affect people's mental health, their stress, their anxiety. And then there's sort of what's coming in the future, which is anxiety about it, just us talking about this,
Right.
right? Like some people feel like we have no control over this. It's happening. We're a victim in it. All of that exacerbates kind of, the mental health sort of, if you will, the way someone goes about their day to day life, right? All of that can impact it.
I agree, and I think, even just the ways that we talk about these things, comparing it to the ways that we were taught growing up versus the ways that we're now talking to our children about it, it is almost sort of how do we prepare for the inevitable and almost expect things to happen from a preparation perspective, right? And you talked about long-lasting impacts of catastrophic weather events, where the biggest one that happened in our country was in Katrina, where, entire communities relocated to different states, different cities, and with that comes the impact of both small and large businesses, of economic, socioeconomic changes of who lives where and how people make money. And so leaders have to make decisions both in the short term and the long term when it comes to these things, including where do we put our offices, right? Or where do we put our facilities at the points of risk mitigation? And so, from that perspective, how do these impacts show up at work? And how can leaders be best prepared so that there's not a spot or a perspective that they miss out on, both from a tactical perspective and from a long term employee well being perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another really great question, and you know, leaders might overlook the signs, and so it's really important that they're aware of what some of these signs look like so that they know how to address them effectively. One of them is, increased absenteeism and presenteeism, right? So if you have people who are impacted by extreme weather and they're taking more sick days or they're coming to work unwell, that's going to affect productivity, right? So that's like kind of your presenteeism. So it's really important to try to recognize that. um, you'll see it in a decline in, like, work performance. Oftentimes, you'll notice that individuals are, they're not as focused because when they have a lot of anxiety or depression or PTSD, they're kind of struggling to stay mentally engaged. You really start to see it change in behavior and mood. And I think that's one of the things that we all need to look for with each other. Managers need to know their team and their employees, but peers and colleagues also have to look out for each other because that's when you really start to sort of see those changes in behavior when you know someone and they're not acting quite the same. If people are stressed, Jerry, they don't sleep. And so oftentimes you see people who are, have sleep disturbances, they're tired, they're yawning all the time, they're not kind of as focused. Or you have people that have like I mean, this is another big issue, like physical conditions, like headaches, stomach aches, things like that. Like, how do you, and maybe there's not something to attribute it. So, those are kind of the signs that employers need to look for. And what they can do about it is to really foster open communication, right? Really create a psychologically safe environment where people can have these dialogues. They make it okay for employees to share the one silver lining, always trying to look for the glass half full here, of these types of events is you have a shared experience when you're going through it with other people. So people can really rely on each other and count on each other for all of that. It's important to be able to have resources, know what they are, and know how to access them, right? So it could be your EAP, it could be mental health resources. You mentioned earlier about the Zoom, like someone might be able to get on a Zoom or might not, but like flexible work schedules, or policies, because I do think so much of this is we got to be prepared ahead of time as a workplace, knowing that these really events can happen. And then what do we do when it happens, right? So having some of these policies in place of flexible hours, and then I'm always a big advocate of training, and management really need to know what we just talked about, like what are the signs that they should be looking for, and what should they do when when something like that happens.
These are such wonderful points you bring up, Marjorie. And I think another thing to consider too is the secondary and tertiary relationships, right? And so I may not be impacted, but if my family is in an area
Right.
that we're not in, I'm still not sleeping because I'm worried about them.
That's
Maybe I'm
right.
taking in people. When displacements happen and evacuations happen, people go to family and friends, and so that might be, or in our never-ending news cycle, just the anxiety of the news, right, and how it
Right.
impacts
Right.
people not directly in the path. And so where we are in Los Angeles, we were not in the direct path of fires, but we're keeping in touch with friends. Our lives are disrupted because that impacts, our children's school and sports schedules are impacted. And so there is certainly a tertiary, secondary and tertiary effects of these things that impact how people show up, if they can show up to work, that I think managers, as you mentioned, and colleagues and clients, vendors, whatever the relationship is, just be mindful of, and have that relationship and that expectation that it is something that people need to be talking about, right? And I think, culturally, sometimes people don't want to share as much or just want to toughen it out and show up. And I think, it is a good suggestion that you have to be able to have these expectations of open communication so that people can feel comfortable showing up. Are there particular lenses through whether it be industries or regions that we generally believe to be a little bit more prone to climate disruption? Does that impact retention, recruitment, productivity, or even where should we open up our next facility? How does that play?
Um, yeah, you know what? I was just gonna go backwards really quickly to kind of also to piggyback on what you're saying. Survivor's guilt is also involved in this. Cause like when you mentioned that, every because you're absolutely spot on. It affects everybody. But what happens, like I lived through the Scripps Ranch fire in San Diego,
Mm.
and I lived in Scripps Ranch, and my house was okay, but many of my neighbors were not. And there's all kinds of this kind of survivors guilt of like why their house and not mine, or why this community, or your house is fine, but you can't go back in it because of smoke damage. So I think I just want to kind of double click on your point because I think it's such an important one, is that it's oftentimes the stress, the mental health benefit, the symptoms aren't as obvious as someone might think. It might not be as, it could be someone lost their house. I mean, I know several people in LA right now who are still housing people who lost houses. Now, all of a sudden, you don't really have your family just as your family. You've got guests in your house. So I wanted to just take a moment and just kind of like acknowledge that, because I think it was a really good point, because depending on sort of where you are, all of those things will change. I mean, so for example, recruitment, right? So there was a study that was done that 76% of millennials consider a company's social and environmental commitment when they decide where to work. So, I mean, I think as far as like thinking about certain areas, I think it's really, especially with this younger generation, they're going to think about it. And then that could affect like retention. So there could be issues in climate vulnerable regions, right? So if there are areas that are, you know, going to be oftentimes could be affected by it, it could make it harder to recruit people. Um, you know, all kinds of all kinds of things like that, and I guess I would imagine maybe less about industries, but more about geography, like where some of these companies are. As an employer, you gotta think about it. Like, if you know that you're in an area that tends to get tornadoes in the Midwest, or tends to go through hurricanes in Florida, or earthquakes in, California, all of those are going to be areas that you're gonna wanna think about when it comes to retention. And, some of the ways maybe that companies can mitigate it, like we talked about, like flexible work plans, you could talk about that when you're interviewing or letting people know that you're making an investment into a resilient infrastructure. You're aware that extreme weather can affect the business, that you have a policy in place, that you prioritize employees' well-being, really keeping good communication. And I think saying all that on the front end and then following through with it will really sort of help it so that you're in a situation where if you're vulnerable, we call it that, climate vulnerable, companies. And by the way, we should also be talking about that companies may have an office or within in a area that has some vulnerability, but yet that they might have other offices that don't, right? So it might be that your office in California has to have different kinds of policies than your office in Michigan.
No, I think again, like it is something that we have now accepted as the, again, not from a defeatist mindset perspective, but let's prepare for that it will happen, right? And so let's talk a little bit more about actionable steps, right? And so we know that regionally things might be different, generationally things might be different, different industries will, experience different things. But from a reaction perspective, we've talked about how some of these events can, in the short term, trigger trauma, anxiety, even PTSD. Those have lingering effects as well. Those have been well studied. Walk us through what symptoms employers should look out for or be even proactively asking about in their teams and in their ecosystems post disaster to be most helpful to them.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's things that you would kind of be aware of to say that person doesn't seem quite right. Are they irritable? Do they have mood swings? Do they seem withdrawn? Right? A lot of times if we have to be really careful when we see people withdraw, we tend to think, oh, they're, ignoring us or they're mad at us. And we need to be, it's really important we don't take it personally, that we are like really looking at our people as like, are you okay? Are they hyper vigilant? I mean, a lot of times this brings out hypervigilance where you're on edge, right? Depending on what it is, you're like operating from a state of fear. It takes a while physically for that body to calm down. And for some people, it could be days. For some people, it could be weeks. For other people, it could be months, even years. I mean, you'll hear stories about people who have been exposed to these traumatic events and they carry it with them their whole lifetimes. You you want to be aware of the cognitive difficulties, right? Things like, are they concentrating? Do they have a hard time focusing, right? Can they make decisions? Do they seem disoriented? I've heard a lot of people say that um, in these kind of post types of situations, I had someone share with me recently that they had a friend who lost their house in the fire, and once that happened, they were reliving this trauma, Jerry, from they had a stillborn. This was 25 years earlier, but, it brought back all of that trauma. So one of the things that happens with trauma, it's like a magnet to other trauma. So when you have these events, sometimes, like, you'll see people just being really upset about something that's disconnected to the event, but it's actually all connected. It's sort of a trigger. And then, of course, you have your physical symptoms, right? Are they tired, like we talked about, because maybe they're not sleeping? Do they have those kind of somatic things, headaches, stomach aches, things like that? But listen, as employers, we need to get the job done. So you're going to see it. You oftentimes can see it as decreased productivity, like frequent, days off, things like that. You might see an increase in substance use. So all of that to say, these things will impact your employees, these types of events, they will. But there are actionable steps that leaders can do. And I think so much of this is preparing for it on the front end so that you actually have yourself a plan when it happens. So it's so important to foster open communication.
Mm,
Create what we call psychologically safe environments where people feel comfortable sharing their experiences and their challenges. The more people feel comfortable talking about it, the more you can create an environment that you can find out what's really going on and provide those kind of resources. Most companies have really good mental health resources, EAPs, mental health services, but knowing how to access them is really important. Knowing how to get employees to go find it, and whatever other flexibility might make sense within reason, right? Because we got to get the job done. But offering flexibility during these times is really important. Like you said, if you're evacuated or whatever it might be, you're gonna have to be very, 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 very flexible. And then, just really educating the managers, right? So that they know what to do.
We talked about tracking absenteeism and, I guess just paying attention or being present in the workplace rather. Is there, and when we talk to leaders, are there different things that we should be mindful of in a remote first environment? And I want to bring that up because even though there's a lot of conversations about, work from home, transitioning back to in the office, we still are we're still in a predominantly remote, whether permanently or in a hybrid situation. It's hard to track, right? And somebody continues to show up to Zoom, right? Where because it doesn't really matter where they're calling in from, it's hard to track that. The badging system, obviously, if somebody's coming in late or they look bothered, but we attend meetings now with the cameras off, and it's hard to pick up on some of these things that we used to be able to. What are some of the different things that those leaders can do so that it's not too late for them to be helpful?
It's such a great question because you're right. I mean, it's a whole nother challenge. And I think it is really okay to say you must turn your camera on. And it's in a caring way. I want to put eyeballs on you. I want to make sure that you're okay. And, oftentimes I've heard people say the first few minutes of every meeting, you should every virtual meeting, you should allow for some type of social chit chat, if you will, because you miss that, right? And then you're absolutely right. It's hard to know how someone's doing if it's just like it's business and they're off. And that can add so much more stress to it. So creating these, I often talk about this like it's quality over quantity. We all just need to kind of find our people, have our people that we know. And it's so important at work that we have a person or two. We don't need all of them. It could be your manager, it doesn't have to be. It could be your subordinate, it doesn't have to be. It's feeling connected to someone and feeling comfortable and safe to share with someone. And I think then that, and we all need to do that for each other, right? You don't just have to be that for someone that you have to have them be that both ways, give and to take. And when you have that person, sometimes it's really hard, but you have to be willing to ask the hard questions. Are you okay? And I'd say ask that question. You don't have to have the answer like of how to fix it. I think sometimes so many of us fall into this trap of feeling like we don't want to ask if you're okay because we feel like we have to fix it. We don't know how to fix it. We don't have to. What we have to do is just be good listeners. Just listen, make that person feel like we hear them, they're heard. And you can do that by just repeating sometimes what they say, like, wow, it sounds like this has been really, really, really stressful for you. And I completely understand. Empathy goes such a long way. I can only imagine how you feel. Like those little things, Jerry, will make such a difference especially in that remote environment where, you don't see someone. And I'm so glad you asked that question because it's so important.
I agree. We talked about the sort of the reactive things that business leaders can do. Let's touch upon, as we wrap here, sort of the proactive things. What can leaders do? What does it look like to integrate climate resilience, the climate vulnerabilities, and the known impacts of possible climate events into a company's mental health strategy, into a recruitment strategy, to be proactive about these things?
Yeah, I how great would it be if every company had one of these kind of strategies? So it's like it let's start embedding climate considerations in their mental health programs. I mean, every company has thought about mental health, especially it's been top of mind now. So like, really acknowledging that there are these climate related stressors and recognizing that they can lead to all the things we're talking about, anxiety, grief, trauma, and then incorporating these discussions into the existing mental health initiatives, training, training up the managers and letting them know, and even just everybody, letting them know that, these things are going to happen and that we all have to be supportive to each other. Really do some front end research on what are the relevant resources. What are the coping strategies, coming up with like a preparedness plan, right? Are we able to say, if the internet goes down, we have this, or if, just like you would design any emergency plan, but also it's not just your physical safety, it's also just like, what do we do for someone's mental health when these kind of incidents happen? And I think it's important to do regular drills and trainings, just like really take it seriously, let people know that you take it seriously. You want to foster a supportive organizational culture, right? You want to, again, and I can't say it enough, promoting open dialogue is so important because it's going to make your employees feel heard, feel valued, feel cared for. And that is what we get when we end up getting a lot more productivity out of our employees. Again, coming up with flexible work policies. Um, I've talked to some companies that have done like community and environmental initiatives where they have like volunteer days or things like that that can help sort of show we care about the environment. Even though it doesn't have to do with extreme weather, it still shows that they care about environmental projects and things like that. So it kind of shows we're doing our part to try to mitigate kind of these traumatic types of events. And just, I think at the end of the day, really just educating to, your employees on sort of what to do, and then just keep assessing them. How is it doing? How are we doing? And make changes to the policy as it's going. This is a new frontier. I mean, this isn't something we've done. Critical incident training, we've done, trauma informed trainings. This is new. And I am going to suspect every company at some point is going to need to be thinking about it. So, like, let's all learn from each other. If companies are doing things that are, making a difference and they work, let's all learn. And just, I think talking about it's the first step.
And as you mentioned, different generations, and then we don't want to generalize all generations, but employees are starting to ask employers of these questions, right? What is your policy on this? What happens in this case, right? And I think, the questions, and I think they're good questions for also leaders to ask of their own organizations, right? Because they have to lead people who will prioritize mental health maybe more so than previous generations, right? No judgment either way there, but that is the reality of what's happening, and so if you want to recruit the best, if you want to retain the best, and if you want to have the A team, these are important things to at least be mindful of and to be asking, far beyond where do we open our offices? What is our operational procedure? But, the climate impacted and even the not so climate impacted mental health effects of all these things are important if you want to build a great team. And so, Marjorie Morrison, it's been wonderful. Let me ask, will we wrap up our episode of Tomorrow's with this final question? What is the one thing that leaders can do tomorrow to get started on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much what we've, been talking about. Validate your employees' experience. Let them know what you're saying matters. I hear you. That that's going to foster trust. The open communications, you know, encourage proactive coping strategies like problem solving, resilience building strategies. Um, have, like we talked about, have meeting check-ins, like, dedicate a few minutes every day to just kind of see how people are doing. Especially if there was a climate event, even if it was weeks ago, months ago, you'd be surprised if you give people the space to talk, what they'll share. And that doesn't mean that you're triggering that trauma. What that means is that you care and you're giving people space. And I promise you that actually helps people focus more on work because they feel that they're cared for. Keep sharing resources. I know we have a lot of resources, but sometimes people just don't know what they are. Leading by example, right? Being able to share your own concerns, your own experiences. That creates a space. Like, I'm sure we all have seen this before. If we admit something, we create a space to make it okay for everybody else to do those things too. And, like, just encourage the conversations of climate, right? Like, participating in events, thinking about events, and, just we're all on this earth together, so.
This has been really fascinating, and I hope it's given our audience, an opportunity to either validate some of the concerns that you've had or experienced, or have sparked a new idea to begin conversations within your own team, your own leadership level, and even your organizations about what we can do to both prepare and to react to some of the climate events that we have seen and that we will continue to see, particularly through the lens of mental health. Marjorie Morrison, SHRM's mental health executive in residence, thank you so much for coming on Tomorrowist. I'm your host, Jerry Wan, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Tomorrowist. And here's to a better tomorrow.
SHRM.